priest's voice was shaking, not from emotion, from the cold. The small stone chapel at the edge of Velmore sat with its doors flung open to a gray November morning, and the wind moved through it without permission, lifting the edges of the cheap white tablecloth someone had laid across the altar and rattling the single string of paper decorations that hung between the pews. There were perhaps 80 people crowded into that chapel, and none of them had come to celebrate. They had come to watch. There is a particular quality to the attention of a town that has gathered to see one of its own humiliated, and this crowd had that quality exactly. The forward lean, the bright eyes, the barely suppressed murmur of people who had been looking forward to this for days. At the altar stood a girl named Lena Voss. She was 23 years old, and she was wearing a dress that had belonged to her mother. Cream cotton gone slightly yellow at the seams, altered twice because her mother had been broader through the shoulders. Her hair was pinned back with a clip that had lost one of its teeth. Her shoes were clean but old, the leather creased across the toe of each foot in the permanent way of shoes worn for years of walking on hard surfaces. She was pale. Not the pale of a nervous bride, but the pale of someone who has been awake for 3 nights running because they have run out of ways to think about the thing they cannot stop thinking about. Beside her stood Victor Bosch. He was 54 years old. He smelled of pipe tobacco and the particular sweetness of cheap cologne applied in excess. His suit was expensive by the standards of Velmore, which was not a town with high standards for anything. He wore a gold ring on each hand that he had not removed for the ceremony. He had not looked at Lena once since she walked down the aisle. He had looked at her father, seated in the front pew, with the expression of a man who has made a transaction he is very pleased with. And he had looked at the crowd, and he had looked at the priest with the impatient expression of someone waiting for a necessary formality to conclude. What would you do if your father sold you? Not metaphorically. Not in the complicated emotional way that phrase is sometimes used. Literally sold you, signed a piece of paper that transferred legal obligation for his gambling debts to a moneylender in exchange for your hand in marriage, and then walked you to the altar of a chapel you had been baptized in front of the entire town that had watched you grow up and told you to smile. What would you do if you had no money, no power, no allies, no options, and nowhere to run? What if I told you that in 11 minutes, the ground outside that chapel was going to shake, and 52 armored vehicles were going to seal every road in and out of Velmore, and what happened next would leave every single person in that chapel unable to speak for an amount of time they would each remember for the rest of their lives? But to understand what happened next, you need to go back 8 months. You need to go back to the road outside Velmore in the early days of March, when the mud was still hard and the sky was still the pale gray of winter, refusing to end. And a man in worn clothing sat at the side of that road with a twisted ankle and no way to move. And a girl on her way home from the market found him there. Lena Voss had been walking that road since she was 7 years old. It was the road between Velmore and the next town's market, 4 miles each way, and she walked it twice a week with a canvas bag on each shoulder, carrying whatever she had managed to sell from the small kitchen garden behind the house she shared with her father. The garden was hers, maintained by her, planned by her, harvested by her. Her father, Gregor Voss, contributed to the household by sleeping late, gambling in the evenings, and occasionally reminding Lena in tones that suggested she should be grateful that he had not yet thrown her out. On that Tuesday in March, she found the man about a mile from the chapel, seated on a stone at the road's edge, his left foot extended in front of him at an angle that said everything about what had happened. He was perhaps 50, or perhaps looked 50, in the way that difficult lives age a face before its time. He wore a heavy coat, dark wool, worn at the elbows, and a wool cap pulled low. His hands were bare and cold. He had a pack beside him, leather, old but not cheap, and he was looking at his ankle with the expression of someone calculating a problem they have not yet solved. She stopped. She asked him what had happened. He told her, in a voice with an accent she could not entirely place, that he had come off the road in a rut and turned the ankle badly. He had been sitting there for approximately 40 minutes. 3 people had passed him in that time, without stopping. Lena set her bags down. She examined the ankle without being asked, with the practical confidence of someone who had been treating her own injuries without medical help for long enough to know what she was looking at. It was not broken. It was badly sprained. She opened one of her bags and found the length of cotton cloth she used to wrap vegetables for market, and bound the ankle with it. She gave him water from her canteen. She sat with him until the swelling had settled enough that he could bear weight, and then she helped him walk the remaining mile to Velmore's single inn, her canvas bags in one hand and his arm over her shoulder, taking his weight without complaint. At the inn, she spoke to the innkeeper's wife, arranged a room at a rate she quietly negotiated down because she could see from the man's pack that he was not carrying enough money to cover the standard price for more than 2 nights. And then she went to the kitchen and came back 20 minutes later with a covered bowl of soup. She had prepared herself in the inn's kitchen because she had talked the cook into letting her use the stove for half an hour in exchange for 2 bags of herbs from her garden. The man sat in the inn's small common room with the soup bowl in his hands and looked at her with an expression she could not read. He was not a man whose face gave away much, but something in his eyes, which were dark and steady and considerably sharper than his clothing suggested, was paying attention to her in a way that felt different from ordinary attention. "Why did you do all this?" he asked. The accent was there again, precise consonants, a formality beneath the simplicity of the question. "Because you needed help," she said, as if this explained everything, which to her it did. 3 others walked past you. I know. I'm not responsible for what they did." She picked up her empty bags. "Stay off the ankle for 3 days. The innkeeper's wife will bring meals to the room. I've arranged it." She paused at the door. "Safe travels when you're well enough." She walked home. She did not ask his name. He did not offer it. She did not think about him much afterward, because her life at that time did not allow for extended thought about anything that was not immediately practical. Her father had begun the gambling debts that would ultimately consume them both approximately 4 years earlier. At first, small sums that he convinced himself and occasionally her were temporary, then larger sums, then sums large enough that men from the next town had come to the house twice in the last year with written notices that she had intercepted before her father could lose them behind the stove. She had managed barely through the garden and through the small income she earned from taking in mending. She had managed until Victor Bosch came to the house himself one Tuesday evening in September, sat at the kitchen table across from her father, and laid out terms that left Gregor Voss looking, for the first time in a long time, genuinely satisfied. She had been in the next room. She had heard everything. The debt was more than she had known. The number Bosch named for her hand was one she recognized as exactly equal to what her father owed him, because Bosch was not a sentimental man, and the arithmetic was clean. Her father had agreed before Bosch finished the sentence. She had stood in that next room for a long moment after the door closed, and then she had gone back to the kitchen and washed the 2 cups they had used for tea. She had considered over the following weeks her options and found them to be the following: leave with no money and nowhere to go, and leave her father to a debt she suspected Bosch would find other ways to collect in her absence. Stay and submit to the arrangement, or find a way to acquire enough money to pay the debt herself, which was not a realistic option on the income from a kitchen garden and a mending basket in a town of 300 people, and which she had nonetheless spent 3 weeks attempting to calculate a path toward, because she was the kind of person who tries everything before accepting that trying is over. She could not find the path. She accepted the arrangement. She said nothing dramatic about it. She asked her father once, and only once, if he had considered any alternative, and he had told her that she was being ungrateful, that Bosch was a man of means, and this was an opportunity for both of them, and she had looked at him for a long moment and then gone back to the garden. The town of Velmore had opinions about all of this. The town of Velmore had opinions about everything. Lena Voss was a subject of particular interest to those opinions because she had always been slightly outside the town's social texture, slightly too self-contained, slightly too unbothered by the hierarchies that mattered enormously to people who lived their entire lives inside 3 miles of each other. They said she was cold. They said she was strange. They said that whatever happened to her was probably something she had brought on herself. And they said this without being able to articulate exactly how. But they said it with confidence. On the morning of the wedding, 3 women she had known since childhood stood outside the chapel and discussed her dress loudly enough for her to hear as she went inside. One said it was pathetic. One said at least Bosch was getting something for his money, though God knows what. The third laughed in a way that was designed to carry. Lena walked past them without changing her expression. Inside the chapel, she stood at the altar and listened to the priest and felt the cold and looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the altar that she had been looking at since she was a child, and tried to locate inside herself some point of stillness she could stand on until this was finished. Victor Bosch, beside her, shifted his weight from foot to foot. He smelled strongly of the cologne. He had not yet touched her, which she was grateful for, though she understood that this was temporary. His 2 associates, men who attended him everywhere in Velmore with the air of dogs that are loyal entirely because they have been fed, sat in the second pew and watched the proceedings with the satisfied expressions of people who have already had their entertainment for the day. From the pews, someone whispered something she could not hear, and several people laughed. The priest looked up briefly, pained, and then looked back at his book. He had been the priest here for 30 years and baptized Lena himself and did not enjoy this morning, but also could not see what could be done about it. And then the ground moved, not violently, not like an earthquake, like something very heavy was moving very close, in very large numbers, and the accumulated weight of it traveled through the stone floor of the chapel, the way music travels through the body of an instrument. People looked at each other. The laughter stopped. Victor Bosch frowned and turned toward the open chapel doors, and through those doors, down the single main road of Velmore, they saw the first vehicles appear. They were black. They were the kind of black that does not occur naturally, a black manufactured with care, the deep matte black of armored military vehicles whose exterior absorbs light rather than reflecting it. They were large, each one, larger than anything that routinely traveled the roads of Velmore, and they moved in a formation that was not the formation of civilian traffic, the perfect disciplined spacing of a military convoy, each vehicle maintaining the same distance from the one before it, each one moving at the same speed, the whole column of them moving together like a single organism with 52 components. They were already surrounding the town. They had come from 3 directions simultaneously, and by the time the people in the chapel had registered the first vehicles on the main road, the roads east and west of Velmore were already sealed. There was nowhere to go. Not that most of the people in the chapel understood yet that they needed to go somewhere. The convoy stopped. The engines, which had been audible even through the stone walls, went quiet in the same instant, which was its own kind of unsettling, that synchronized silence. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the doors of the lead vehicles opened, and the men who emerged were wearing uniforms that nobody in Velmore had seen before in person, though several people recognized them from news broadcasts, with the delayed, disoriented recognition of people seeing something in an unexpected context. The uniforms were deep navy with gold braid at the shoulder, formal military dress rather than tactical gear, but the men wearing them moved with the economy of people who are formally dressed because the occasion requires it, and not because they lack other capabilities. They were carrying things. 4 of them, moving in pairs, each pair carrying a steel case between them, by handles on each side. The cases approximately the size of a large trunk, moving with the particular care and deliberateness of people carrying something substantial. They came through the chapel doors without pausing, without asking anyone to move, though people moved anyway, pressing back against the pews on instinct, the way people move away from things that project authority without performing it. The four pairs walked the length of the aisle and set the cases down in front of the altar, two on each side, the steel surfaces catching the gray morning light from the open doors. Victor Bosch had backed away from the altar. He was not a cowardly man in the ordinary sense, but he was a practical one, and what he was looking at fell entirely outside the range of things he had plans for. His associates in the second pew were on their feet, looking at each other and then at the doors, calculating something. Gregor Voss, in the first pew, had the expression of a man who has eaten something that does not agree with him. The 8 soldiers stood back from the cases, and 2 of them, simultaneously, opened them. The light that came from the first case wasn't light exactly, but the effect of light on surfaces that were not accustomed to this chapel's gray illumination. Gold bars, stacked in rows of 5, each bar the dull, warm yellow of refined metal, filling the interior of the case from base to lid, the weight of each bar evident in the precision of how they had been packed. No movement, no settling, packed by people who understood the material they were handling. The second case was identical. 8 bars across the top row alone, and 5 rows deep, and the cases were not small. The third case contained papers. These were arranged in a flat wooden tray, and the soldiers lifted the tray out and held it for the room to see. They were legal documents, and anyone near enough to read them began doing so with the rapid attention of people who suddenly understand that a document concerns them. They were debt papers. The specific debt instruments that Victor Bosch held against Gregor Voss, notarized, witnessed, bearing the date and the amount that Lena had overheard in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in September. Across each one, in red, a single word, settled. The fourth case held property deeds. The soldiers held them up one by one. The deed to Victor Bosch's house, the deed to the building where he ran his money-lending operation, the deed to 3 lots he owned on the edge of town, and 2 properties in the next village over, the deed to the cottage that Gregor Voss had mortgaged 3 years ago without telling his daughter. Each deed bore a transfer notation. Each one was now held by an entity named in formal legal language that people in the pews leaned toward each other to read and puzzle over in low, urgent voices. Victor Bosch said, in a voice that was attempting authority and finding it unavailable, "What is the meaning of 'be quiet'?" The voice came from the doors. It was not loud. It had the quality of a voice that has spent a lifetime not needing to be loud, because the volume of authority runs on a different frequency than the volume of sound. Every head in the chapel turned. The man walking through the chapel doors was not dressed in uniform. He wore a suit, dark gray, the kind of tailoring that is invisible to people who do not know how to look at it, and unmistakable to people who do. He was perhaps 50, or looked perhaps 50, in the way that a life of weight and decision shapes a face into something that does not photograph its own age accurately. He was not tall in a dramatic way. He was simply present in a way that made the space around him feel reorganized. His eyes, dark and very steady, moved across the chapel with the unhurried attention of someone reading a document they have already been briefed on. They stopped on Lena. She had not moved from her place at the altar. She had watched the cases arrive, watched them open, watched the papers and the gold and the deeds, and her face had remained what it had been since she walked into this chapel, still and very pale, and completely composed in the way of a person who has decided that composure is the only thing left they own and is not going to surrender it. She looked at the man in the doorway. She recognized him in stages, the way recognition works when context has shifted so dramatically that the brain must work to connect what it is seeing to what it has already stored. The coat, the steady eyes, the particular quality of attention in that face, the attention of a person who is always gathering information and is very good at not showing it. The road outside Velmore in the early days of March, the stone at the road's edge, the ankle extended at the wrong angle. She said nothing. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the chapel was absolutely silent around them. He walked the length of the aisle, past the open cases, past the frozen figures of Victor Bosch and Gregor Voss, past 300 confused and frightened and utterly riveted townspeople, and stopped in front of the altar. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a card, small, cream-colored, heavy stock, which he held out to the priest. The priest took it with hands that were not entirely steady and read it, and his expression moved through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, doubt, and then something that looked very much like the face of a man who has just understood that he has been underestimating the situation significantly. The card was passed, at the priest's whispered instruction, to the nearest person in the front pew, and from there it traveled hand to hand through the chapel with increasing velocity as each person read it and passed it to the next. And the sound the chapel made as it traveled was not talking exactly, but a succession of small, sharp intakes of breath that built on each other until the whole room was making a sound like a tide coming in. The card bore, in engraved lettering, a name and a title. The name was Alexei Konstantin Varin. The title was Emperor of the Varenic Confederation, sovereign ruler of 7 territories, head of state, and, as a separate line made clear, the individual ranked by 3 consecutive independent assessments as the single wealthiest person on the inhabited surface of the earth. Victor Bosch sat down on the altar step. He did not choose to sit down. His legs made the choice for him. Gregor Voss had the expression of a man watching the floor open beneath his feet in very slow motion. The emperor, because that was what he was, looked at Lena. "I told you," he said quietly, in the voice she remembered from the road, "that if there was ever anything within my power, I would not forget." He paused. "I am not a man who forgets." Lena looked at him. She looked at the gold in the open cases. She looked at the settled debt papers and the transferred deeds. She looked at the man who had sat on a stone on a cold road and let her bind his ankle with a piece of cloth, while 3 other people walked past without stopping, and who had looked at her with those dark and steady eyes and asked why she had stopped, and received her answer, which was that he had needed help, as if it were the most complete answer available, which she had believed it was. "I don't need to be saved," she said, because she was Lena Voss, and this was simply true. "I know," he said. "You have never needed to be saved. What you have needed is for the people around you to have sufficient reason to stop doing what they have been doing." He glanced briefly at Victor Bosch, sitting on the altar step, and then at Gregor Voss, and the glance was the kind that does not linger because it has already extracted everything of interest. "I believe the reason has now been supplied." He turned to the room. When he spoke to the full chapel, his voice did not rise, but it occupied the space completely, the way the right instrument fills the right acoustic. "The debt Gregor Voss incurred with Victor Bosch is settled in full. The documentation is in this room and will be registered with every relevant legal authority before this afternoon. The properties transferred to the holdings listed on those deeds are now under my administration, which means that Mr. Bosch's money-lending operation has no premises in which to operate, and Mr. Voss's assets are held in trust against future debts, which means they cannot be mortgaged, sold, or wagered." He paused. "If Mr. Bosch attempts to operate his business through any other means in this or any neighboring jurisdiction, he will find that the Varenic Confederation's Financial Oversight Authority has a very long administrative reach and a great deal of patience for detail work." Victor Bosch, from his position on the altar step, opened his mouth. "I would not," the emperor said pleasantly, without looking at him. Bosch closed his mouth. One of the soldiers stepped forward and placed a final document on the altar. This one bound in leather, heavy, formal, bearing a seal in dark red wax that was the size of a man's palm. The soldier opened it flat and stepped back. It was a formal agreement of betrothal, executed under Varenic imperial law, which in 7 territories was the highest civil law available. It bore the emperor's signature at the bottom, and a space beside it, and beside that space, written in a formal script that nonetheless managed to be legible, a name, Lena Voss. Her actual name, spelled correctly, in a document that had clearly been prepared with care. Lena looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the man standing beside her, who was watching her with the same dark and steady attention she had seen on a cold road in March. The attention of a person who is gathering information and is very good at not showing what they intend to do with it. She understood, looking at him now, that she had never seen a man work harder to be seen as ordinary, and she understood in the same instant that the ordinariness had been real. The cold road had been real. The 40 minutes alone before she came had been real. He had sat on that stone as himself, not as an emperor, and she had helped a man on a cold road, not an emperor, and the distinction was the entire point. "You could have told me who you were," she said. "Yes," he said, "and then I would never have known who you were." He looked at the betrothal document and then back at her. "You are under no obligation. I want to be precise about that. Everything in those cases is yours, regardless of your answer. The debt is settled. The deeds are transferred. None of that is conditional." He paused. "But I would like, if you are willing, to ask you properly. There are moments that a room holds. Every person in the chapel was holding this one. The 80 people of Velmore who had come to watch a girl be sold, and were now watching something they did not have language for yet, but would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite managing it. The women who had stood outside and commented on the dress. The men who had sat in the back pews with their arms folded. Victor Bosch on the altar step. Gregor Voss in the front pew, looking at his daughter with the expression of a man who has understood, too late and too completely, what he had and what he did with it. Lena looked at her father for a long moment. He could not meet her eyes. She looked at the stain on the ceiling above the altar, the water stain she had been looking at since childhood. She looked at the document on the altar, her name in careful formal script beside a space that waited. She picked up the pen the soldier offered. She signed her name. The chapel made a sound that was not a gasp and not a cheer, something between the two, the involuntary sound of a room releasing a breath it had been holding. What followed was administrative rather than dramatic, but no less devastating for that. The soldiers moved with the efficiency of people executing a plan that had been prepared in detail for longer than the people affected by it would have believed. The property deeds were collected and transferred. With the relevant legal witnesses, the soldiers had brought their own, who were introduced with credentials that the chapel's small population had no framework for disputing. Victor Bosch was informed by a legal officer, politely and at length, of the precise nature of his new financial position, which was not quite ruin, but was close enough to ruin that the distance between them was academic. His 2 associates in the second pew were presented with documents indicating that their employment by Bosch was now legally complicated in ways that would require considerable effort to untangle. Gregor Voss was the last. The soldier who approached him was carrying a single sheet of paper and a pen, and he explained, in the particular clear and emotionless tone of a man who has delivered bad news in official contexts enough times to have refined it to a form that is simultaneously precise and undeniable, that the trust arrangement for Voss's remaining assets meant that he retained use of the cottage, but not ownership, could not sell or mortgage anything, and would receive from the trust a monthly sum sufficient for basic maintenance of himself and the property, nothing more. The gambling debts he had incurred elsewhere, beyond the Bosch obligation, had been identified and tallied by investigators who had apparently been working with some thoroughness for some time. He signed the paper. He had no choice about the paper, the legal officer explained, because its provisions were already in effect, and the signature was simply acknowledgement, not agreement. Lena, standing beside the emperor at the door of the chapel, did not watch her father sign. She looked instead at the convoy outside, the 52 matte black vehicles sealed along the roads of Velmore in both directions, the uniformed soldiers standing at intervals between them, the whole apparatus of it arranged around this small stone chapel in a gray November morning with the quiet, comprehensive authority of something that had been planned with care and was now executing without deviation. It was, she thought, a great deal of machinery to have brought to a small town for a small girl in a yellowed dress. She was not sure yet what to do with that fact. She suspected she had a considerable amount of time to figure it out. The emperor stood beside her and did not rush her. He had, she was beginning to understand, a very developed capacity for patience, the kind of patience that belongs to people who are certain of outcomes and can therefore afford to wait for them. "We can leave when you're ready," he said. "There is no hurry." "There are things I'd like to take from the cottage," she said. "It won't take long. I travel light." "I know," he said. "I remember your bags." She looked at him. He was looking at the convoy, at the vehicles and the soldiers, and the gray November sky above Velmore, and his expression was the expression of a man who has done the thing he came to do and is now prepared for whatever comes next. She thought about a road in March. She thought about cold hands and a twisted ankle and soup made in an inn's kitchen with herbs from her garden. She thought about a question, "Why did you do all this?" And her own answer, which had seemed complete to her then and still seemed complete to her now, "Because you needed help." She had helped a man on a road the way she would have helped anyone on a road, because that was who she was, and who she was had turned out to be the thing that mattered most, the thing that had been seen by someone with the patience and the resources to wait for the right moment to say so. They walked through the chapel doors together, and the convoy doors opened in a wave from front to back, each vehicle's door swinging out in the same moment, and the sound of it was a kind of punctuation. She climbed into the lead vehicle, which was warm and dark and very quiet inside, the city noise and chapel and gray morning all instantly muffled, and she sat in the seat and looked through the tinted window at Velmore, the stone facades and the narrow street and the faces appearing at the doors of the chapel, the 80 people of that town standing in the doorway and watching the convoy begin to move. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply looked at them once and then looked forward through the windscreen at the road ahead, which was clear, which was always going to be clear, because 52 armored vehicles had already made it clear in both directions, and the convoy was moving, and Velmore behind the tinted glass grew smaller in the way that things you are leaving grow smaller, steadily and without sentiment, until the road curved, and there was only the road and the pale winter trees alongside it, and the sound of the vehicles moving together in perfect formation. True kindness, Lena understood on that road, does not perform itself. It does not announce itself, or wait to be seen, or calculate its return. It acts because action is what is needed, and it asks nothing from the person it helps. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even a name. She had helped a man on a road and asked for nothing, and in asking for nothing, she had given him the one thing that all his wealth and power could not purchase from anyone else. She had given him the truth of who she was, and he had given it back to her in the most comprehensive way available. Not a rescue, a recognition. That is the distinction that matters. That is the thing the town of Velmore would spend years trying to understand and never quite manage, because understanding it requires believing that kindness is not a transaction, and some people are simply not built for that kind of belief. Did you love watching an entire town's cruelty get answered by 52 armored vehicles on a cold November morning? Did Gregor Voss finally get exactly what he deserved? And did Victor Bosch get even more than that? If this story of extraordinary karma and quiet, devastating justice moved you the way it moved us. Smash that like button right now. Share it with everyone you know who believes that kindness is never wasted, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of the universe paying exactly what it owes to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment.